She's supposed to be family, but every time I'm near her, I forget what that even means. The first time I really noticed her, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just another adult in the house, moving through the kitchen with the kind of ease that only comes from familiarity. But there was something in the way she carried herself, graceful, deliberate, almost hypnotic, that made it impossible to ignore. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the blinds, casting long, warm stripes across the living room, and her shadow stretched like a soft promise across the floor. I felt a flutter I couldn't name, a mix of curiosity and unease. It was a small gesture, really. She reached for a cookbook on the counter, and our hands brushed, just fingertips, but enough to send a quiet jolt up my arm. I froze, hoping she hadn't noticed the sudden warmth that pooled in my chest. When our eyes met, she smiled, a fleeting, gentle smile that seemed to acknowledge something unspoken. My mind immediately scolded me, "She's your stepmom. She's off limits." Yet a part of me couldn't look away. The smell of her perfume lingered in the air, faint but distinct, a subtle mixture of vanilla and something green, earthy, calming. It wrapped around me unexpectedly, and for a moment, the world outside that room, the expectations, the rules, the word, family, faded to the background. I watched as she moved around the kitchen, her movements so fluid it was almost like she was dancing to music only she could hear. Even in her laughter, soft and unassuming, there was an unexpected warmth that seemed to reach across the room and land somewhere inside me. I tried to focus on anything else, my phone buzzing with notifications, the sound of the fridge humming, but everything felt muted compared to the quiet gravity of her presence. I caught her glancing at me once, and it wasn't just a casual look. It lingered, subtle but insistent, as if she sensed that I was noticing things I shouldn't, that I was aware of an invisible line neither of us had crossed, yet. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough, I was sure, that even she might hear it. Even the smallest details stuck with me. The way her fingers brushed her hair behind her ear, the way the sunlight caught the slight curve of her cheek, the faint tension in her shoulders when she carried herself in that serene, composed way. There was an elegance to her presence that contrasted sharply with my own restless energy, and I realized that I was both drawn to it and afraid of it. The guilt was immediate, these feelings were not supposed to exist, but there was no stopping them. By the time she left the kitchen, the room seemed emptier, colder somehow, even though nothing had changed. I sank back into the couch, my mind spinning with fragments of the encounter, replaying each glance, each brush of skin, each unspoken word. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a fleeting thought destined to fade, but I already knew it wouldn't. From that first encounter, a tension had been planted, quiet but insistent, like the first thread of a story I wasn't sure I was allowed to write. And somehow, despite the rules, despite the warning bells in my mind, I found myself waiting, already aware that nothing would ever be quite the same again. It started innocently enough, a minor household chore that left the two of us confined to the same space. Mom had gone out for groceries, leaving us to deal with a leaky faucet in the kitchen. I had grabbed the wrench, expecting a simple, mundane task, but I didn't count on the quiet charge that filled the room the moment she appeared, surveying the situation with a calm authority. Her presence was immediate. Even standing across from me, she radiated warmth, like sunlight trapped in a human form. I tried to focus on the task, tightening the bolt and adjusting the pipe, but I couldn't stop noticing the subtle way her hair caught the light, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the soft cadence of her laughter when I fumbled with the wrench. Every accidental brush of our hands sent a tiny jolt up my arm, sharp and impossible to ignore. We ended up sitting on the floor to reach the last stubborn section of the pipe. Our knees brushed against each other, tentative at first, then slightly more deliberate as we adjusted positions. Her hand paused near mine, hovering, before moving, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of her skin. I couldn't decide if I should pull away or let it linger. The air between us felt heavier somehow, as if it were charged with something neither of us wanted to name. There was a quiet intimacy in the shared task. She leaned over to inspect my work, and I caught the subtle curve of her neck, the scent of her perfume, soft and calming, mixing with the faint smell of pipe grease. I realized I was hyper-aware of every little detail, how her fingers brushed against the wrench, the small crease of concentration in her brow, the way her eyes softened when she caught me staring. There was a rhythm to our movements, almost unintentional, that made the moment feel suspended outside time. At one point, she laughed softly at my awkward attempt to explain the fix. It was the kind of laugh that makes the room feel smaller, cozier, and suddenly I was acutely aware of the proximity of her shoulder to mine. I felt her exhale near me, a warm, subtle gust that brushed against my arm, and my chest tightened with an emotion I didn't dare name. Guilt and desire swirled together in a confusing knot. These feelings were inappropriate, yet impossible to ignore. By the time the faucet stopped leaking, the tension hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened, wrapped in the quiet companionship of shared effort. We stood up slowly, brushing against each other one last time, lingering just slightly longer than necessary. I noticed her glance, brief but loaded, as if she too had felt the subtle current between us. As she returned to the living room, I stayed behind for a moment, gripping the wrench a little too tightly, heart pounding, mind racing. That ordinary chore had become something extraordinary, an accidental intimacy that neither of us could fully acknowledge, yet both of us felt in every nerve. And for the first time, I realized that the quiet tension I had felt before wasn't going to fade. It was growing, threading itself into every shared moment, leaving me simultaneously exhilarated and unsettled. The day ended, but the memory lingered, her warmth, her laugh, the fleeting brush of her hand, and I knew this was only the beginning. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the sky presses down with quiet weight and the world outside feels distant and blurred. The living room smelled faintly of wet earth drifting in from the open window, and the soft hum of rain against the panes made the room feel smaller, cozier, almost like it had been carved out just for the two of us. Somehow, we ended up sitting on the couch together, a blanket thrown over our shoulders more out of practicality than design, yet the effect was intimate nonetheless. I had expected silence. Instead, she spoke first, her voice soft and unassuming, almost hesitant. "It's strange, sometimes I forget the world outside this house," she admitted, glancing at the window, her eyes distant. "I forget responsibilities. I forget even family, sometimes." I stayed quiet, unsure whether I should respond. There was a tremor in her voice, barely perceptible, but enough to pull at something deep inside me. I shifted closer, instinctively offering her a little more warmth under the shared blanket. The small touch, our legs brushing, shoulders almost touching, felt electric in a subtle, forbidden way. My chest tightened, a mix of concern and something far more complicated. She looked at me then, directly, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability laid bare. There was no mask, no poised exterior, just her, human and real, and it was impossible not to notice. I wanted to say something comforting, something meaningful, but words felt heavy, inadequate. Instead, I let my hand hover near hers, almost brushing the edge of her fingers. She didn't pull away, in fact, she moved slightly closer, the smallest gesture, but enough to make my heart lurch. We spoke of trivial things at first, books, music, little anecdotes, but gradually the conversation sank deeper. She told me about the loneliness that came with being the adult everyone depended on, the quiet ache of wanting to be understood beyond the role she played. I listened, compelled, captivated, aware of the steady warmth radiating from her mere presence. Every pause, every glance, every subtle gesture became magnified in my mind. Her fingers twined lightly with the edge of the blanket, and I found myself imagining what it would feel like if our hands truly met. There was no rush, no sudden leap into something unthinkable. Just quiet, suspended moments, charged with honesty. I realized how rare it was to find someone who made you feel seen without judgment, someone whose mere proximity could unspool the tightly wound tension you carried inside. My chest ached with a longing I barely understood, part protectiveness, part something far more dangerous, and entirely intoxicating. When the rain finally eased, she let out a soft sigh, her cheek brushing against the back of the couch. I felt an urge to reach out, to offer comfort, yet I restrained myself, letting the moment linger. That night, the invisible line between family and something more blurred in the quiet intimacy of shared vulnerability. By the time I left the room, the memory of her voice, the faint tremor in her hands, and the warmth of her shoulder against mine stayed with me. For the first time, I understood that the emotional connection we were building was more than fleeting, it was a thread weaving itself between us, delicate yet undeniable. And though nothing had crossed into the forbidden, the tension between us hummed quietly, promising that this was only the beginning. It was an ordinary evening, yet somehow it felt different. The kitchen was bathed in soft, golden light from the overhead lamp, casting gentle shadows on the walls. I was reaching for a glass on the counter when she appeared behind me, her presence immediately filling the space. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, subtle but undeniable, and I realized that even a mundane moment could feel electric when she was near. Our hands brushed as we both reached for the same glass. Just fingertips, but enough to make my chest tighten. I felt her glance flick to mine, holding for a heartbeat longer than expected, and I could almost see the playful curiosity in her eyes. She smiled softly, a small curve of her lips that seemed deliberate, teasing, but gentle. "You know," she said quietly, leaning slightly against the counter so our shoulders almost touched, "sometimes you make me forget the word family." The words hung in the air like fragile glass, shimmering with meaning I wasn't supposed to interpret. I froze, heart hammering, mind scrambling to process what she had just said. Was it a joke? A comment on the awkwardness of our household dynamics? Or something deeper, something she was daring me to notice? My throat went dry, and I had to clear it before answering, though even the sound of my own voice seemed loud in the charged quiet of the kitchen. I swallowed, trying to play it casual, yet every nerve in my body was alert, every sense tuned to her. The faint scent of her perfume, vanilla and something earthy, drifted past me, and I realized I was acutely aware of her proximity, of the subtle curve of her shoulder near mine, the way her fingers lightly rested on the counter. Even in the act of reaching for a glass, the simplest motions carried an intimacy I couldn't ignore. She noticed my hesitation and let out a soft, knowing laugh, one that seemed to acknowledge the tension but didn't push it further. It was comforting and tantalizing all at once. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed to vanish under the weight of the moment. Instead, I moved just a fraction closer, almost imperceptibly, and she didn't pull away. The silence stretched between us, not empty, but full of unspoken questions, quiet recognition, and the thrill of a line neither of us had crossed yet. Every small gesture now felt loaded, the brush of our arms, the tilt of her head, the lingering warmth when our hands had met. Even the mundane act of filling a glass with water became a charged exchange, a dance of glances and subtle touches. I was painfully aware of how drawn I was to her, of how impossible it was to ignore the pull between us, and yet I also knew we were teetering on the edge of something we weren't ready to name. By the time the moment passed, she had turned away to place the glass in the cupboard, leaving me with a lingering warmth on my fingertips and a pulse that refused to slow. Her words replayed in my mind, "You make me forget the word family." It was teasing, vulnerable, and daring all at once, a confession without a label, a tension wrapped in a whisper. That night, I lay in bed replaying the moment, realizing that the line between familiarity and something far more complicated had begun to blur. And for the first time, I understood that our relationship wasn't just going to be ordinary, it was quietly, irrevocably changing, one subtle touch, one glance, one whispered confession at a time. The days that followed were a delicate dance of awareness and restraint. Every shared glance, every accidental touch seemed to hum with a quiet electricity I couldn't ignore. I tried to act normal, to bury the flutter in my chest under mundane routines, but she had a way of drawing me in that made it impossible to remain detached. Even ordinary interactions carried weight, subtle and insistent. It was during an evening walk, under a sky brushed with fading orange and soft twilight, that the tension became almost tangible. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from a passing rain shower. She suggested we take a short walk to clear our heads, and I found myself agreeing before I could stop the impulse. As we walked side by side, the space between us felt charged, alive with the things we didn't say. A sudden stumble on my part, a small misstep over an uneven pavement, brought her hand to my arm. Her touch was light, almost casual, but I felt the warmth of her fingers sear through my nerves. I instinctively steadied myself, aware of how close we had become, our shoulders brushing as we adjusted our positions. She looked at me, a soft smile tugging at her lips, and I could see a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes, a mixture of worry, amusement, and something more complicated, more dangerous. Every movement, every gesture now felt amplified. The brush of her fingers against mine when she passed me the scarf to shield from the evening chill, the slight tilt of her head when she laughed at a careless joke, the subtle catch in her breath when our bodies came close, all of it left me simultaneously exhilarated and uneasy. I knew the feelings stirring inside me were inappropriate, yet they felt impossible to suppress. We paused by a quiet park bench, the twilight shadows stretching around us. The silence was heavy, almost intimate, and I noticed the way she seemed to occupy the space with ease, yet with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. Our conversation drifted into personal territory, small revelations about work frustrations, fleeting regrets, and private worries. Each admission felt like a key turning in a lock, opening doors to a level of emotional intimacy I hadn't expected. I felt her glance linger on me, subtle but undeniable, and I knew she could sense the same tension I carried. It wasn't just attraction, it was a profound awareness of one another's presence, a magnetic pull wrapped in caution. The line between family and desire had blurred even further, and neither of us was willing to cross it openly, yet both of us were acutely aware of the space between restraint and surrender. By the time we returned home, the evening had left an invisible mark on both of us. My chest still hummed with the memory of her touch, the warmth of her proximity, and the ache of unspoken words. The tension had heightened, thickened by every shared glance, every lingering touch, and every pause that carried more meaning than any spoken confession could. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the walk replayed endlessly. I knew the bond between us was deepening, threading itself through our daily interactions, wrapping around our hearts with a quiet insistence. And I realized that the longer this continued, the harder it would be to separate what was proper from what we both secretly craved. It was late, the kind of quiet night where the house seemed to breathe around us. The living room was dimly lit, just enough light spilling from the lamp to soften the edges of the furniture. Outside, the world was hushed, wrapped in darkness, but inside, the tension between us had become impossible to ignore. I found her sitting on the couch, curled slightly under a soft throw, her eyes distant yet alive, as if the weight of everything she'd been holding in had finally found a place to settle. I joined her, sitting close enough that our shoulders brushed. The contact was light, almost accidental, but the warmth radiating from her was undeniable, a steady pulse that mirrored my own. The air between us felt thick, charged with every unspoken word, every glance that had lingered too long, every accidental touch that neither of us could forget. She turned to me, her gaze soft but intense, and for the first time, I felt like she was letting me truly see her, the part of her that wasn't the composed, graceful adult everyone admired, but the person who longed for understanding, for connection, for something real. Sometimes, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, you make me forget the word family. The words hit me like a pulse of electricity. They weren't playful anymore, they carried vulnerability, confession, and an undeniable longing. My chest tightened, my breath catching in a way that made it hard to speak. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between us, yet I hesitated, aware of the fragile line we were walking. Our hands hovered near each other, a quiet question in the space between us. When our fingers finally touched, it was tentative, a gentle brush that sent warmth spiraling through my entire body. She didn't pull away, instead, she leaned just slightly closer, her shoulder resting against mine, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft hum of the room. I felt the steady beat of her heart, slow but insistent, and realized that I was not alone in this moment. The conversation that followed was soft, intimate, and honest. We spoke of loneliness, of desires we weren't supposed to have, of the rare, unexpected moments of connection that made the rest of the world fade away. Every word, every pause, every glance was laden with meaning. I felt her hand graze mine again, fingertips trailing in a way that spoke volumes, and I shivered, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity of proximity and trust. It was not about crossing boundaries, it was about acknowledging them, understanding them, and yet finding solace in the closeness we allowed ourselves. Our eyes met, a silent understanding passing between us, an acknowledgement of feelings that could not be ignored but did not need to be named aloud. When she leaned her head slightly toward my shoulder, the warmth and softness of her presence enveloped me. I rested my hand lightly over hers, careful yet certain, feeling the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat beneath my fingers. For a long while, we simply existed in that space, side by side, aware of one another in a way that transcended words. That night marked a turning point. The tension, the longing, the quiet admissions, all had culminated into something tangible yet respectful, intimate yet safe. The invisible thread between us had been pulled taut, and we both knew that our connection had deepened beyond anything ordinary. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what she had meant, and of what we both secretly desired, without needing to step over the line that kept us grounded. The morning sunlight spilled gently through the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow across the kitchen. The world outside had moved on, but inside, there was a quiet stillness, a lingering warmth from the night before. I found her already at the table, a cup of tea in her hands, her expression calm yet thoughtful, as if she, too, had been replaying the events of the previous evening. Sitting across from her, I felt the familiar mix of nervous anticipation and quiet comfort. The tension that had defined the past few weeks hadn't vanished, but it had softened, transformed into something steady and reassuring. Every glance we exchanged carried meaning, but without urgency or confusion, just the unspoken acknowledgement of what we had shared. As I reached for my cup, our hands brushed lightly over the table. The touch was fleeting but deliberate enough to send a ripple of warmth up my arm. I noticed the subtle smile tugging at her lips, the gentle light in her eyes that had first drawn me in weeks ago. It wasn't a spark of desire this time, it was something deeper, more enduring, a quiet recognition of connection, trust, and mutual understanding. We spoke softly, almost in whispers, about trivial things, plans for the day, errands, little household matters, but beneath the words, there was a profound layer of intimacy. Every pause, every laugh, every glance carried the memory of shared vulnerability and subtle, electric touches. It was a language of its own, built over countless moments of hesitation, closeness, and quiet confession. At one point, she reached across the table, letting her fingers rest briefly over mine. The gesture was simple, understated, yet it held the weight of all the unspoken emotions that had been building between us. I felt her warmth, steady and reassuring, and I realized that this careful, gentle connection, was exactly what we had both needed. It wasn't about crossing boundaries or breaking rules, it was about acknowledging the bond we had formed and nurturing it with care. The conversation drifted naturally, filled with laughter and ease, the kind that comes when two people know each other beyond appearances. I noticed the little things, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the soft tone she used when sharing a thought. Each detail reminded me why the quiet tension of the past weeks had mattered so much. It had led us here, to a place of calm, understanding, and mutual respect. Before leaving the table, she rested her hand on mine one last time, her touch lingering just long enough to make me feel seen and cherished. I returned the gesture, careful and deliberate, letting the warmth between us settle without words. There was no rush, no need for grand declarations, just the quiet affirmation that our connection had grown into something meaningful, sustainable, and real. As I moved away, the sunlight catching her hair, I realized that the story of us had reached a satisfying pause. We were no longer defined by tension, hesitation, or unspoken longing, we were defined by presence, warmth, and the gentle intimacy that had blossomed through shared moments. And in that quiet, golden morning light, I understood that some bonds, once formed, could be cherished without needing to cross any line. Sometimes, the deepest connections were the ones that thrived in the spaces we carefully allowed for them. If this slow burn story made your heart race or left you thinking about forbidden attraction, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new chapter of romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment touched you the most.